When Jonathan Carter discovered an old diary belonging to his housekeeper, he never expected it would reveal a secret that would shatter his family. The unfolding betrayals and deceptions force him to choose between truth and legacy. His decision will surprise even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the very beginning. Jonathan Carter, a well-known millionaire and owner of a chain of luxury hotels, was accustomed to luxury and comfort. His life was meticulously organized. Every business deal, meeting, and even his daily schedule was planned with impeccable precision. In this world of order and stability, he liked to control every aspect of his life. However, in recent weeks, Jonathan's sense of peace had been disturbed. He felt as though something, or someone, was subtly invading his personal space. Sometimes he noticed a faint movement in the mirror. Other times he heard rustling in the empty rooms of his vast mansion. But whenever he turned around, there was nothing suspicious. Jonathan tried to chalk it up to fatigue or an overly busy work schedule, but the feeling of unease wouldn't leave him. One evening, returning home after an investor meeting earlier than planned, he found Margaret, his housekeeper, in the foyer. He was used to seeing her only during specific hours when her work wouldn't interfere with his schedule, so her presence at that moment surprised him. Margaret stood by the staircase, nervously packing her belongings into her bag. She looked tense and focused, as if she had been caught in the act. Jonathan paused, alert, but kept a calm expression. "Margaret, is something wrong?" he inquired, masking his suspicion with a polite smile. She looked up at him, and confusion flickered in her eyes. "Oh, Mr. Carter, I just got a little delayed," she stammered. "Cleaning took longer than usual. I apologize." Her words didn't sound convincing. Jonathan had known this woman for years, and she was always composed and collected. But now her movements were hurried and uncertain. He glanced her over, and suddenly something caught his attention. A small notebook had slipped out of her bag, and in her haste, she didn't notice. The notebook slid to the floor and stopped near his feet, partially hidden under the hem of her coat. Margaret quickly apologized and, without waiting for a response, hurried to the exit. Jonathan stood still, watching her leave the mansion. Alone in the foyer, his gaze fell once more on the notebook. At first he hesitated. Should he pick it up or leave it, respecting Margaret's privacy? But what he had just witnessed disturbed him. Why was she so nervous? Why had she left so abruptly? Curiosity got the better of him. He bent down and picked up the notebook. His fingers trembled slightly as he examined the old cover and tattered pages. What could she be writing about? He thought. Jonathan slowly opened the first page and immediately realized that these weren't ordinary notes. The first page contained personal information about him, his schedule, habits, even what he had eaten for breakfast and dinner in recent days. The entries were so precise and detailed that Jonathan froze for a moment. Is she spying on me? He thought. He continued flipping through the pages, and each one revealed new details that clearly related to his life. But what truly shocked him were the entries about his family. Today, I saw him again. He doesn't know the truth about his mother, he read. In that moment, his heart tightened. These words felt like a warning signal. He tried to recall when Margaret could have spoken with his mother, but she had been gone for years. Jonathan's mother had passed away long ago, and his memories of her were always filled with warmth. She was a kind and caring woman, a true lady he admired. But these entries cast doubt on everything he knew. The truth about my mother? The words echoed in his mind. He began flipping through the diary faster, hoping to find something that would clarify the situation. The entries grew more cryptic, but they included details that troubled him. Names, dates, mentions of secret meetings, and mysterious individuals. Suddenly, he felt a chill. For the first time in his life, he sensed that his reality, which had seemed so secure and stable, was beginning to crumble. What if everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie? The thought flashed through his mind. He closed the notebook and pressed it to his chest, trying to gather his thoughts. Who is Margaret really? Why is she watching me? And what truth is she talking about? The questions piled up like a snowball. He understood that what lay ahead was much more significant than he could have imagined. This wasn't just a case involving a housekeeper. It could be the beginning of uncovering a massive family secret. Jonathan rose from his chair and, feeling the tension build, returned to his study. He knew he had to find out the truth, even if it would be painful. Jonathan Carter was deeply shocked by what he had read in the diary. Over and over, he replayed those words in his mind. He doesn't know the truth about his mother. Those lines haunted him. His mother had always been the embodiment of kindness and dignity for him, her image forming the foundation of both his childhood and adult memories. After her death, Jonathan kept only the bright moments in his memory, avoiding the sorrowful ones. But Margaret's diary cast doubt on everything he knew and believed in. His mind frantically tried to piece together this puzzle, but to no avail. Who was Margaret in my mother's life? Why does she write such things? And what truth is hidden behind these words? These questions tormented him. He knew he couldn't just let it go. The decision came naturally. He had to conduct his own investigation and find out what was really going on. The first step was to speak to Margaret directly. He decided to approach her carefully so as not to reveal his anxiety. The next day, he met her in one of the hallways of his mansion and struck up a conversation, pretending to check on staff performance. "Margaret, I wanted to thank you for your work. Everything always looks perfect," he said, trying to appear friendly and casual. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she replied with a slight smile, but there was a trace of anxiety in her eyes. "I wanted to discuss a few things about our security system. We plan to update it and possibly add a few new features. As someone who's here often, you must have noticed how everything works. Is there anything you've seen or heard that might be useful for us?" Jonathan asked, watching her reaction closely. Margaret clearly looked nervous. She averted her gaze, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to keep up the conversation. "Oh, honestly, I haven't noticed anything unusual. Everything seems fine," she said, trying to sound confident, but her voice betrayed tension. Jonathan realized her reaction was a sign. She was hiding something, but didn't want or couldn't tell him. After the brief conversation, which didn't yield the answers he wanted, he decided to take a different approach. That same night, when the house was empty, he set up hidden cameras in several key locations to monitor her actions. He wanted to understand what was really going on when he wasn't watching. Days passed. Jonathan carefully reviewed the footage every evening, but he saw nothing unusual. Margaret behaved normally. She cleaned rooms, kept things in order, and nothing about her actions seemed suspicious. However, one evening, while reviewing the recordings, Jonathan stumbled upon an intriguing moment. In the video, Margaret stood in one of the empty rooms and spoke on the phone. Her voice was tense, and she gazed out the window as if afraid someone might overhear. "I can't live like this anymore," she said, then added, "Day X is approaching. He must know the truth, and I can't keep hiding it." These words made Jonathan tense. Day X? What day was she referring to, and what truth did she mean? Her tone was serious, almost desperate. This no longer felt like a random or fabricated story. Margaret clearly knew something significant, and this information was directly connected to him and his family. He felt it wasn't enough to understand the situation. He needed to dig deeper. Jonathan contacted one of the best private detectives he knew and invited him to the mansion. He described the situation in detail and showed the detective the recording of Margaret's conversation. Jonathan wanted to find out who she was talking to and why the mentioned Day X was so important to her. "I want you to find out who the person on the other end of the line is and what connection they have to my family," Jonathan told the detective, his voice filled with determination. "I need to know the truth, no matter what it means." The detective, a professional with many years of experience, promised to take on the case immediately. He said he would start by surveilling Margaret and finding out who she was in contact with. Meanwhile, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. A few days of tense anticipation passed before the detective returned to Jonathan with the results of his investigation. Jonathan, waiting in his office, was filled with anxious expectation. He knew the answers would be difficult to accept. but he was prepared to face them, no matter how bitter they might be. "I have information you won't like, Mr. Carter," the detective began, fixing his gaze on Jonathan. "Speak," Jonathan replied curtly, clenching his fists. The detective opened a folder filled with documents and photographs. "Margaret used to be an employee at one of your family's old hotels, but that's not all. In her youth, she worked with your mother at one of the first hotels your grandfather opened." This revelation took Jonathan by surprise. He knew his mother had worked in the family business, but had never heard of any close friends among the staff. However, the detective continued. They weren't just colleagues. They had a close relationship, one they kept hidden from everyone. There is information suggesting they shared a secret that affected not only them, but also your family. Jonathan frowned, trying to process what he had heard. "What secret, and what kind of connection?" he asked, feeling a growing unease within him. "That remains unclear for now," the detective replied. "But Margaret's diary mentioned a particular date, which may be connected to your mother's past. I discovered that on that date, they worked together at a hotel that is now closed and abandoned. I think you should visit the place and look for answers there." A mixture of fear and curiosity stirred within Jonathan. He knew he was about to face something that might destroy his perception of the past, but despite this, he decided to visit the hotel. The next day, Jonathan arrived at the old building that had once been his grandfather's pride. It looked abandoned and forgotten, its facade cracked, and the windows boarded up. He paused at the entrance, feeling a strange tension, as if the building itself held the secret he was about to uncover. Upon entering, he was overwhelmed by a wave of memories. He recalled visiting the place as a child with his mother, walking through the hallways, and watching the staff prepare rooms for guests. Now, these corridors were empty and gloomy, covered in dust and cobwebs. Jonathan headed to the hotel's archive, located at the back of the building. The archive was his last hope of finding something that might explain what his mother and Margaret had been involved in. An old cabinet filled with folders and boxes stood in the corner, and he began methodically sorting through documents, old reports, and records. After some time, nearly losing hope, he stumbled upon a small box labeled "Personal Files." Inside, he found a few photographs and documents, but one folder caught his attention. It bore his mother's name. He opened it and discovered several old photographs. They showed his mother in her youth, laughing and embracing a young man he didn't recognize. They looked happy and in love. Jonathan could hardly believe his eyes. He had never seen these photos before. They were so personal that it felt as if they had been deliberately hidden from prying eyes. But the real shock came with a note attached to one of the photos. It read, "I hope Jonathan never finds out the truth about his real father." He froze, holding the photo, trying to comprehend its meaning. Real father? The thought struck him like lightning. Jonathan stared at the picture of the man, trying to figure out who he was. This wasn't the person he had believed to be his father all his life. This young man in the photo. He might be his real father, someone he knew nothing about. His world began to crumble. The memories he had cherished so dearly started to lose their significance. Everything he knew about his family now seemed like an illusion, carefully maintained to hide some secret. He felt a mix of anger and disappointment building inside him. Why had his mother hidden this? Why had Margaret remained close all these years without ever saying a word? Jonathan realized he had to find out who this man was and what really happened. But one thing was clear. His life would never be the same again. Jonathan returned home in a state of shock. His mind raced with anger and confusion, and he knew he had to confront Margaret immediately. Everything he had discovered at the old hotel had turned his world upside down, and he could no longer tolerate uncertainty. The mansion was silent. Only the echo of Jonathan's footsteps resounded on the marble floor as he made his way to the room where Margaret was. He opened the door abruptly, and Margaret, who had been dusting, flinched at the sight of his face, twisted with anger. "Margaret," he began, his voice cold and firm. "We need to talk, and this time I want the truth." She froze, lowering the rag. trying to maintain her composure. "What do you mean, Mr. Carter?" she asked, attempting to appear calm. "Don't pretend," he continued, ignoring her attempts to hide her fear. "I went to the old hotel. I found pictures of my mother with a man I don't recognize, and I know you know the truth. What really happened?" Margaret averted her eyes for a moment, her hands trembling. She tried to say something, but hesitated, as if she didn't know where to begin. Jonathan stepped closer, his expression resolute. "If you don't tell me everything right now, I'll make sure you never work in any hotel in this country again. I will find the truth, Margaret, with or without your help." She understood she had no choice, and her face changed. It seemed as if the walls she had built around herself for years were crumbling under his pressure. Sighing, she lowered her head and spoke quietly. "All right, Mr. Carter. You're right. You deserve to know the truth. I worked with your mother at that hotel when we were both young. She was in love with one of the workers, an ordinary man but with a big heart. They were happy and even ran away together for a few months. She wanted to start a new life, away from the demands and pressures of her family." Jonathan felt a surge of anger within him, but he forced himself to listen. "But their happiness didn't last," Margaret continued. "The Carter family couldn't allow their daughter, the heir to such wealth and influence, to tie her life to a simple worker. They found her and gave her an ultimatum. Either she returned, or they would ruin his life and reputation. Your mother was forced to return, threatened for both her and her lover's sake. She complied, but she had to sever all ties with him." Jonathan was stunned. He knew his family always cared about its reputation, but he had no idea how far they were willing to go to protect it. "And then what?" he demanded, his voice growing more strained. Margaret closed her eyes as if preparing for the most difficult part. "You are the result of their love, Jonathan. Your mother became pregnant, but she couldn't let your father know about your existence. The family forced her to hide everything, and she agreed to protect you and him. Your real father never knew he had a son." These words hit Jonathan like a thunderclap. He stared at Margaret in disbelief. Everything he had believed in, his family, his origins, was a lie. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he asked, his voice filled with pain and anger. "I stayed with your family to watch over you," she answered. "I was close to your mother, and she entrusted me with your care, so I could see you grow into the man you are. She wanted you to be safe, and she didn't want anyone to harm you, as they had her. I couldn't say anything earlier. It would have been a betrayal of her trust." Jonathan clenched his fists, feeling the rage swell within him. "So, my whole life has been built on lies," he whispered. "All of it was to protect the family's reputation, to hide the truth." Margaret looked at him sadly. "I understand how hard this is to accept, but you are your mother's legacy, her only joy. She would have wanted you to know the truth and to find a way to accept it, even if it's difficult." Jonathan felt betrayed. He was furious with his family, with Margaret, with everyone who had kept the truth from him for so long. "Leave," he said coldly, not taking his eyes off her. "You no longer work here." Margaret stood still for a moment, then slowly nodded and walked toward the exit. As she reached the door, she turned and said one last thing. "I hope that one day you can forgive her, Mr. Carter. She loved you more than anything." Once Margaret was gone, silence fell over the house again. Jonathan stood alone in the empty room, reflecting on what he had heard. Her words echoed in his mind. "You are your mother's legacy, and she would have wanted you to know the truth." But instead of relief or forgiveness, he felt only emptiness and betrayal. Jonathan spent several sleepless nights, turning the recent events over in his mind. Everything he had learned felt like an unbearable weight. The truth he had sought had become a heavy blow. He sat in his office for hours, staring at old photos of his mother, trying to figure out what to do next. "How can I move forward, knowing my whole life was built on lies?" he wondered. Yet he also felt that now that he knew the truth, he couldn't remain passive. After much deliberation, he decided to find his real father. Using his connections and resources, he hired a private detective to track down the man his mother had once run away with. The search took several weeks, but the detective finally found him, a now elderly man living in a modest home on the outskirts of a small town. Jonathan received his address and set out to meet the man who, he hoped, could fill in the missing pieces of his life. As he pulled up to the house, doubts filled his mind. The car stopped outside a humble cottage that looked old and worn. He sat behind the wheel, staring at the windows, which showed no signs of movement. What if I ruin his life? Is it worth revealing this truth after so many years? He wondered. He reached for the door handle several times, but hesitated each time. Doubts gnawed at him. He feared that his appearance would bring only pain and memories best left forgotten. But at one point, as he watched the old man slowly emerge from the house and limp toward a worn garden chair, Jonathan felt his heart tighten. The man looked tired and lonely. He realized that he had the chance to change not just his own life, but also this man's life, to restore something lost. In that moment, Jonathan decided to act. He stepped out of the car and slowly approached the house. As he got closer, the old man looked at him with surprise and wariness. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Jonathan Carter," he began, trying to speak calmly, though his heart raced. "This may seem strange, but I'm here to tell you something important about your life, and mine." The old man frowned, his eyes showing confusion. "What are you talking about, young man? I don't know you." Jonathan sighed, pulling out the photographs he had found in the hotel archive. "My mother, she was with you many years ago. These are her pictures with you. My name is Jonathan, and I'm your son." For a moment, it felt as if time had stopped. The old man took the photographs, staring at them for a long time, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pictures. Tears appeared in his eyes. He looked up at Jonathan and finally, quietly asked, "Is this true? All this time I didn't know. I didn't know I had a son." Jonathan nodded, feeling tears well up in his own eyes. "I didn't know the truth either until recently. I grew up not knowing who my real father was, but now that I know, I'd like to make things right if you'll allow it." The old man couldn't hold back his tears. "I spent my whole life alone. I never found her again, couldn't bring her back. And now, after all these years, you're here." Jonathan moved closer, and placing a hand on his father's shoulder, offered, "You don't have to be alone anymore. I have a home, and I want you to be part of it. We can try to start over." The elderly man remained silent for a long time, then nodded, swallowing his tears. "Thank you, son. I don't know what to say. This is a miracle for me."